I've been seeing a lot of stuff on TikTok about Trump's policies on tariffs and how they're going to have really bad effects for the economy. And I've been wanting to do a video before the election about Trump's economic policies and how they're going to affect the US economy. But I want to focus on a really specific part of these policies, how they're going to affect food prices, which I know sounds super weird, super niche, but I actually think this is probably people's most important expense. And if you think back to when we had massive inflation in the UK and in the US, the big thing people were always pointing to was how expensive their grocery store bill was. And this policy, a lot of the policies that Trump is going to implement, will raise the price of food in the US by a ton. So I want to really zero in on that. But before we get to why I think a lot of these policies are really going to increase food prices, I want to focus on what those policies are. And there are three core pillars of Trump's economic policies. The first is tariffs. Trump says he's going to impose a 10% across the board tariff on all imports. This is a little unclear because he keeps just saying this at rallies. And sometimes he says 10%, sometimes he says 20%. 20% is a crazy high number. 10% is already pretty absurd. He's also said off the cuff that he's going to impose a 100% tariff on imported cars, a 60% tariff on all imported goods from China. With Trump stuff, it's always really hard to tell what the actual specific policies are because he's always just talking from the hip during rallies. But he's been pretty consistent that there will be a dramatic increase in tariffs and that they'll be pretty indiscriminate. We're just going to hit all goods all the time. The other core part of this is to do with taxes. So when Trump was in office previously, he approved $8.4 trillion of borrowing during his term, in part because he was cutting taxes a lot in the economy. And he's committed again to extending his 2017 tax cuts. These would be projected to cost an additional $5 trillion that the US is going to have to find money to pay for somehow, which is a gigantic amount of money. It would mean a ton of borrowing for the government. He's also said he's going to cut the tax rate for corporations by 15% and eliminate income taxes on Social Security benefits. So tons of tax cuts, which are probably going to be popular with voters, but are really poorly thought out and will require the government to borrow tons of money. He's also said, and this isn't specifically an economic policy, he said he's going to do the largest deportation operation in the history of our country. And this isn't strictly an economic policy, but it's going to have really significant economic impacts because there are more than 11 million undocumented immigrants living in the United States. It's about 3% of the US population, and nearly 80% of them have lived in the country for a decade or more. So this is a really key part of the workforce, and we're going to get into that in a second. So why do I think a lot of these policies will have the effect of increasing food prices in the US? The first is when you're imposing tariffs on anything that's imported, that means that when companies import goods from abroad, they're having to pay that additional 10% tariffs. And companies then have a choice either to absorb that tariff themselves and take a reduction in profits, or they can pass that increase in cost onto the consumer. Now, generally, most companies are going to try and protect their profit margins if they think consumers will put up with increases in prices. So a lot of the time, this is going to mean increased prices for consumers directly. But we'd also expect that there are going to be some industries where there is not enough profit margin for them to absorb it anyway. So it's not a question of whether they think consumers will accept the prices. The consumers just will have to accept the price, even if that means those companies sell fewer products. So that cost ends up being passed on to the consumer, which is very inflationary, especially if you're going to apply that to every product in a market, because we would expect, in the vast majority of cases, some cost will be passed on to consumers. That means if you're just applying a 10% tariff, that's very similar to the inflation rate at the very peak when we were having an inflation crisis in the UK and an inflation crisis in the US. That was 10% inflation. And so you're going to expect similar levels of inflation in response to just implementing this as a policy, especially given the number of goods that the US imports. But specifically for agriculture, this is a really big problem because there's tons of goods that the agricultural sector relies on that are imported that help farms in the US produce goods that cannot be produced domestically. And a really big one for this is fertilizers. So the US imports about $13.3 billion worth of fertilizers from countries like Canada, Russia, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Oman. About 90% of the fertilizer that's used in the US is imported. And the reason it has to be imported is because it relies on natural resources like phosphates that are not that available in the US. So they have to import it from countries that have like natural resources of nitrogen, of phosphates that are outside of the US, there's no way that a tariff can encourage fertilizer production within the US because there just aren't enough of those basic natural resources to support the production of enough fertilizer. So it will have to be imported, and companies and farms in the US are going to have to pay an additional at least 10% on those fertilizers in order to be able to import them and use them. That's going to drive up costs for consumers. The other big part of this is stuff like agricultural machinery. So the US agricultural machinery market, about 25 to 30% of the agricultural machinery used in the US is imported, and it's really key to large-scale farming. So again, that's a good that is needed to produce something in the US that will become more expensive because companies have to import it from abroad, and they're having to pay this, at least 10% tariff. And there's a lot of indications that it's going to be much higher than that. So more than half of US farms use John Deere tractors. And Trump has said directly that he's going to impose a 200% tariff on John Deere tractors, specifically because they're produced in Mexico. We've also got other stuff like animal feed relies a lot on soybeans that are produced in Brazil. That's not quite as much as fertilizers because there's a big soy market in the US as well. But what I'm trying to illustrate with this is domestic industries in the US rely on imports of input goods in order to be able to produce domestically, and cutting those things off or making them more expensive isn't necessarily going to encourage production within the US. And certainly in the case of agriculture, it's going to drive up food prices by a ton. The other big problem with this, and this is moving away from tariffs and talking a lot more about deportations, is whether you agree with it or not, or whether you think this is a good thing or not, the American agricultural sector, it's entirely reliant on undocumented labor to be able to produce goods at the prices that they're currently being produced at, because undocumented workers are being underpaid. And so the reason why food is not as expensive as it otherwise might be is because there's tons of undocumented migrants who are working in American farms. How many? 283,000 undocumented immigrants work as agricultural workers in the US. That is 44% of the workforce. And we assume that this data is underreporting those percentages and those numbers because people generally don't want to tell you that they're undocumented. So it's probably much closer to the majority, or even a significant majority, of farm workers in the US are undocumented. And so if we're doing mass deportations, I don't know if that means kicking 11 million people out of the country, but it certainly is going to remove the vast majority of the workforce for American farms. This is a very big problem because it's going to be very hard to replace those workers, just because there's very few workers who are willing to work on farms because it's hard labor, and also because it's typically seasonal. So you're not getting a job for a full year, you're just getting a job for a couple of months. Most American citizens are not going to accept that as work. So farms just might have a hard time staffing. But also, then you have to follow labor laws. And obviously, it's very bad that people are being paid less than the minimum wage. But the reason why food is not more expensive is because people are being paid less than the minimum wage to work because they are undocumented. So from a purely objective economic analysis, the effect of those deportations will be a dramatic increase in food costs because now people are being paid more to work on farms, and maybe some farms aren't even able to produce that much because they can't get enough workers to be able to harvest the food when it's ready to be harvested. There's tons of other reasons why these policies would be bad for the American economy, and I'm not going to go into all of them. There's a really good University of Penn Wharton School analysis about how this is going to dramatically increase the deficit in the US. They're claiming that it would add to the primary deficit by $5.8 trillion, which is a crazy number. There's also tons of analysis by economists on why this would be inflationary in general. But what I'm trying to illustrate here is, through the example of the agricultural industry, this is specifically how these policies are going to raise prices for a lot of goods in the US. And obviously, if food is more expensive, that's going to have really negative effects in the American economy.